Okay, hello, bonjour, bonjour, bună ziua. Sohochefo John Hampton, Director of Programs, Chickasha Saya, Ixikoyesto Saya. Welcome to the Mackenzie Art Gallery. I'm here to just to say hello to all of you, to start with an acknowledgement of the land that we're standing on, and the traditional caretakers of that land, the Soto, the Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, Lakota, Dakota, and I think that that's fitting to, when we think about that, the homeland of the Métis here, the long relationship that we've had with this land is very fitting for Victor's work, who has a very deep connection and respect and relationship to that land too, and finding ways to have a responsible relationship to it, and thinking about community and how we relate to each other and share that land. And so I want to share that spirit with us today. I also want to thank our core funders for the Mackenzie Art Gallery, the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation, the Canada Council for the Arts, Sask-Culture, the Saskatchewan Arts Board, the City of Regina, and the University of Regina. We have a lot of great speakers here today, so I'm not going to take up too much of your time, and I want to cede the stage to the co-curators of this beautiful exhibition that I hope you've had a chance to view upstairs, The Gardener's Universe, Mackenzie's own Timothy Long, and Julia Krueger. Thank you.
So welcome everybody. The artistic universe of Regina artist Victor Cicansky is firmly rooted in his garden. For over 50 years, ideas for sculptures in ceramics and bronze have grown out of his intimate relationship with the plants and trees of his backyard. His approach embraces both the immigrant knowledge of his Romanian-Canadian family and more contemporary concerns around urban ecology and environmental sustainability. Rooted in local realities, his work speaks to the wider world of the joys and trials of supporting life in an urban prairie space. Challenging craft expectations of ceramic murals, pottery, and furniture, Cicansky engages the language of making to celebrate hand smarts, as his blacksmith father called them. From the iconoclastic experimentation of his student days in California, to the recognition of his prairie immigrant roots, to his celebration of shovel-to-plate gardening, Cicansky has unearthed a politics of place, using humor, play, and provocation. The work of Victor Cicansky asserts that history and locality are vital sources for healthy, creative expression. Just as gardens are essential for the health of our bodies and the planet, this exhibition and panel celebrate a garden universe, as Regina writer Trevor Herriot calls it, and marks Cicansky's lasting contributions to Canadian art and craft history.
This panel presentation grows out of the selection of essays that were produced for the catalogue, which is forthcoming this fall. The contributions of the writers was so extraordinary that we thought we just have to share it with a wider audience. And we're so pleased to welcome 5 of the writers, Julie and myself, Trevor Herriot, Alison Calder, and Susan Surette, for today's panel. We did want to have Garth Johnson, who is also one of the writers, but he had some kind of presentation to give in Macau, so I wanted to tell him we have a casino too, but I'm not sure that would have changed his mind. But we're hoping to bring Garth out later so that you can hear his perspective on Victor's early years in Davis, California, and his nut art experiments here in Regina. So today's format will take, you can see up on the screen here, you get a little sense of where we're going today. We're going to break the panel into 2 parts. Part 1 I'm calling Entering the Garden Universe, and it'll be an exploration of how Victor Cicansky's garden imagery engages art, history, community, and environment. And Trevor will lead us off, and then I'll be giving a presentation on discussing his sealers. And then we'll have a little response time where Trevor and I will invite Victor to come up, and we have a couple of questions. And we'll see how it goes, and we can open things up as well to your questions at that time. Then we're going to go straight into part 2. We're not taking a break. So if you feel the need to get up at any point and grab some refreshments, please feel free to do that. Food and drink is welcome in the theater space, so you're at liberty to do that. Part 2 we're calling Troubling Paradise, an appraisal of how Victor Cicansky has challenged and expanded the definitions of 3 key words: folk, craft, and prairie, through his murals, furniture, and sculpture. So this is, I think we're in for a really interesting discussion of the wider implications of Victor's work. And for those of you who were here for the opening last night, you heard Victor's impassioned words about the importance of gardening, of taking care of our environment, and the crisis that we're facing today in relationship to our stewardship of this planet. So we'll have 3 15-minute presentations by Susan Surette, Krueger, Allison Calder, and then we'll finish off with a response period with some more questions from the writers, and a time as well for your questions. So we're looking forward to a really great afternoon, and we're so glad that you could join us here today for that. I wanted to add one thank you. That is to the Government of Canada through the Museum's Assistance Program of Canadian Heritage, who provided essential funding for both the exhibition, today's the writers and the catalogue are all generously funded through that funding body, as well as the tour of the exhibition. We're really thrilled that the exhibition will be touring to Confederation Centre this fall, and then next year to Glenbow Museum in Calgary. So with that, I think I'm going to start our first section, Julia. Yeah, leave my papers. I'll give you your papers. And I'll start with just a quick introduction of Trevor. I'm not going to introduce myself. And Julia's not going to introduce herself. We got more than adequate introductions last night, for those of you who are here for our formalities at the opening of the exhibition. But I do want to introduce Trevor. He's a naturalist, activist, and author of several award-winning books, including Grass, Sky, Song, and the national bestseller River in a Dry Land, both of which were shortlisted for the Governor General's Award for Nonfiction. He is the 2017 recipient of the Cheryl and Henry Kloppenberg Award for Literary Excellence. Toward a Prairie Atonement, published in October 2016, he took 2 Saskatchewan Book Awards. And he has published essays and articles in the Globe and Mail, Brick, Border Crossings, Canadian Geographic, and several anthologies. Please join me in welcoming Trevor Herriot.
Well, thank you very much, Timothy, and I want to thank Mackenzie and Julia and everybody else involved with this exhibit, and Vic for letting me be a part of this whole thing. And especially for the chance to go and visit Vic at home and see what his garden and his house is like. It was so marvelous. How many of you do a little bit of vegetable gardening? Wow, we are well represented by the gardeners here. Well, that's clear. If you ever have a notion that you should go visit Vic's garden, be careful. It'll put you to shame. It's just an incredible place. And I think of myself as a bit of a gardener, but I I went home in a bit of despair after that, seeing how beautiful the garden can be. And you're going to see it in these images. Just imagine, this is, I think, late summer by the height of the corn and the sunflowers there. I think was it July or August I visited you, Vic?
Yeah.
One of those, I forget. Last summer, you know, my garden was suffering under drought because it's out in the country. Vic's just looked so beautiful. He has a pie-shaped yard, lots of room, and the pie is pointing the right way, of course. The backyard of the garden is huge. Just so full of life. And this sense of his presence there in the garden as this, you know, artful human shaping. There he is, there's the presence. Shaping things. You just, such a beautiful ray. There it is. I can talk a lot about the garden, and I want to say a few things too about just the experience of entering his house and seeing the artwork there, which I talk about in the essay a bit. His father's handcraft work was incredible. Just so fun to see these models of a horse-drawn wagon, a miniature windmill, and then his father Frank's paintings too on the wall, which are so fun and you know, informative too of our heritage here as settler people and agricultural people, and paintings by friends of his. And so the house, of course, is full of art, and the kitchen's right there. The kitchen looks out on the garden. That connection between food in the kitchen and food going outside. And there's the studio just off the garden. The studio clay, things are happening with clay. In the garden, things are happening with clay. You know, just that rich sense of there being this circle happening there. Kitchen, garden, studio, and the life of this man making all of it happen and giving it so much life. So that was a tremendous experience. Going into the studio, I got to see some of the pieces he was working on at the time. He showed me some of the molds that he uses for the preserves, and I saw I saw some of his hand drawings for sketches, for concepts, a little maquette for the gazebo to come to the Grow Regina project, which fingers crossed will come into the light of day sometime soon, and we'll have a wonderful community space there. This is the Queen Street Community Garden there by St. Mark's Church. Anyway, so just seeing all of these things, the branches that he stores, you know, that are the inspiration for a lot of the tree branch work that was in his tables and chairs and so on. And then, of course, we talked a lot about his origins, how he got to be this person. And like any of us, it's about your background, what do you grow up with. And so we learned about his family, his father, and the whole family being people who, as Julie mentioned, you know, work with their hands. We're people who use our hands, who make things. And so, of course, he grew up that way, and he talked about how he made outhouses as a teenager. And I loved some of those stories, the little flourishes he was already adding with a bit of irony and humor on the outhouses as a boy. So I said to him, well, we were just another moment about to say something more about that life of making things and fixing things. It was a sense that it was a part of everyday life, not something, of course, theoretical or you would do in your spare time. It was just the way you live. And it was work, yes, but sometimes it was probably also joyful work and maybe even contemplative. So when he talked about his family and growing up and told stories about that Garlic Flats area of East Regina, which I had heard a little bit about because I have some relatives who are from that same area of Regina and used to visit them back when I was as a kid. But so I just felt like, you know, I have to go see that area with Vic sometimes. So I asked him to take me for a drive through there sometimes. So we made a date, and I picked him up in my car, and we drove down Victoria, and went that corner of Victoria and Park Street, and then south and west of there into some of the streets in that area. And it was just such a treat. I wish we could have just videotaped that and had that shown for you, because you know, every place, even though most of the houses are gone, there's new buildings and so on, it came to life of this history that's all in his experience and his mind, the places he remembered, where they did things, where the big gardens were. They used to cross the tracks, carrying some food for the day with his mom. It was his job and the kids' jobs to keep the mosquito smudging fire going while gardening work was being done. So just this sense, hard to imagine or really understand today, looking at East Regina and seeing fast food places and other businesses there on that corner, hanging out in the neighborhood. Hard to imagine that there was this rich life of Romanian people living there on the margins of Regina, growing these big gardens, the story of taking the pig out to the prairie in the fall to slaughter it, and so on. But of course, Vic's interpretation of that time, because it takes us through, memory and imagination, you could say, in a way, it takes us also into kind of a dangerous territory, in a sense, because there's always nostalgia lurking there for us, and the distortion of memory. But that, I don't believe that happens, in Vic's case at all, because it's not that we shouldn't ever go into our memories in the past in our art and literature. It just means you go with your eyes open for traps and pitfalls, with a sense of humor, as Vic uses, of course, all the time in his art, aware of what we know about our history as settler people. And I think he applies just enough kind of irony and complexity in his art to really handle that well without any of that nostalgia or sentiment that is sometimes there in our whitewashing of history in settler culture. Vic's work, for me, makes me think of concepts of home. What does home really mean? What should it mean for us? I think it's there beneath the beauty and aesthetics of what Vic is doing. Because there are, of course, problems when settlers in a colonized landscape like Saskatchewan define home as a place that belongs to them, right? Ownership is always vexed. But for someone like Vic, I think home is not about ownership. Or something belonging to him. It's about a place where he knows he belongs. I think that's why the God of Class memories and so on are so important to him. It's about a place where he knows he belongs, where he's made a commitment to dwell there responsibly, lightly, and intelligently. If you read Alison Calder's essay, she points out that prairie, whether it's a home for anyone, is one of the most utterly altered and transformed landscapes on the planet. Biologists define provinces, regions by ecoregions, and then sub-within that, eco-districts. So if you go all the way around Regina, there's a big area they call the Regina Eco-District. And this is not just the city, it's way out into the country. But the statistic there is that 99% of it has been cultivated. There's less than 1% of natural landscape left there on that landscape. That's a huge devastation. The natural cover has been almost entirely annihilated. And outside the city, the city has its own footprint, but outside the city, it's probably the growing food, most of all, that has caused that destruction. And the way we have not really been faithful to the treaties that we're supposed to, help us take care of the land together with Indigenous people and share it. But as the critics of agribusiness and the food security, food sovereignty people will remind us, it's not growing food that's the problem. It's the way we grow food. And the way we have made food into commodities, kind of dispirited units of production that we produce with great technological ability and genius to maximize yields and profits. We've got farmers these days telling us that they're not just producing crops, they're also producing what they call ecological goods and services, because they want to be recognized for any of the leftover environmental qualities left on the land. They're saying that they produce those things like healthy water, soil, biodiversity, even beauty, and that perhaps they should be compensated for this. Well, when you make benches out of bronze that leaf out and produce fruit, when you place sexy vegetables on couches and chairs and array them in pantries and root cellars, I think you're puncturing the balloons that are filled with that kind of hot air. You're recognizing and restoring the spirit and life of nature that lives in the food we grow, in our gardens, in our fields. And defying the hubris in our notions of human control of nature, which right now are driving our dysfunctional agricultural systems and pushing people away from healthy food in their own gardens and kitchens and toward food that's prepared by industries and fast food restaurants too often. I think Vic's work returns freedom and control to where it belongs, in the wild eros that's in nature. His work undercuts the idea that humans, for good or ill, are in charge of the planet now, that nature is under human management, and what people are now calling the Anthropocene. This became particularly clear to me a couple of years ago. It was February 2017. And Vic and I and Joe Fafard sat down for a little lunch. Do you remember the lunch we had there at the cafe? We were talking about our shared concerns about the environment and what agriculture is doing to the land, or prairie landscapes in particular. How this happened was Joe and I had both been invited to write very short little essays to accompany a photography book of Saskatchewan landscapes. I was a little worried about this photography book from the beginning because it looked like the pictures were more or less just kind of romanticizing the beauty of prairie landscapes and really not telling the full picture. Well, Joe nailed it. He wrote a powerful essay that told the truth, what's happening to the prairie places that he cares about. He sent me an email saying the editor, the guy doing the book, was concerned that his essay was too negative. And he wanted to edit it. Joe said, what should I do? I said, that's what you feel is true. You got to stick to your truth, hold your ground. And he did. He ended up withdrawing his essay from the book. I tried to sort of dance along the line. My subject was a little different. I was writing about the beauty and the sort of the two-sided nature of fence lines. I was writing about fences. So I left mine in, but in retrospect, I think I probably should have done what Joe did. Anyway, after that little email back and forth, we said, well, let's get together and talk about this and have Vic come along. We'll sit around and talk about our common concerns about what's happening in prairie landscapes under industrialized agriculture without demonizing farmers. It's not them that's driving it. There are way bigger forces than the farmers who are just swept up in it all. So we had a really good visit that day, and we kind of made a tentative plan to get together, maybe do something more, maybe some kind of an artist statement, something in the future. And as it turned out, it didn't get very far, and as we know, Joe's health concerns became a priority pretty quick after that. But I want to read you something that Joe wrote in an email. He said, in the area that I knew in my youth, they are now bulldozing every bluff, draining every slough, and seeding every road allowance to grow more monocrops. Hardly any space is left as habitat for nature's plants and creatures. Well, for me, Vic's life and work has an integrity and depth because of his origins and their role in his decision to stay in the place that holds his past and origins. That past world, of course, has its spirits that inhabit Vic's imagination, not in an unhealthy clinging to the past and nostalgia, but in a way that fully recognizes the blessings and the failures in that former world, not by valorizing it and clinging to it, but precisely by letting it inform and influence his critique and his interpretation of the present. Because, of course, we still eat food that comes from the earth. Some of us still garden, as we see in this room today, and we make preserves. Not in a subsistence economy, maybe so much, but hand-to-mouth engagement with nature is always as near as the soil, the nearest patch of carrots. And Vic's famous inventiveness and playfulness runs along the borders between the wildness of nature and the garden where Eros lives, the same gods that push the pea shoots out of the earth, that drive our own sexual desire and creative urges, and also make the Middle Earth sing. Vic intuited a long time ago, of course, that clay is the perfect medium for celebrating and having fun with memory and connection and relationships. I want to close by saying that I think Victor Cicansky is a truly radical artist in the meaning of that word in many different ways. For sneaking some subversive ideas into his art with a beautiful surface that appeals to our aesthetics, but also in that sense of radical being rootedness, right? Being committed to a place. By original poet Gary Snyder, who was one of the earliest members of the Beat movement, said famously, the most radical thing you can do is stay home. All right? Well, Vic has managed to do that. And he's come to know this place as home, the Regina Plains, in all of its weathers, lights, and shades, and its suffering of all that we have done to it. And he's found ways to use his sculpture to celebrate some of it, critique some of it, make fun of it, all with full awareness of the forces that have shaped it for good or ill into what it is today. Thank you.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here to talk about a little bit about the work of putting the show together and some of the things I learned. Yeah. And where do we start? Okay. Oops. I think we've just lost the PowerPoint. Is it good? Okay, good. Thank you. So as Julia and I were researching this exhibition, we tracked down approximately 1,000 works by Victor Cicansky. He's prolific. And of that 1,000, there were somewhere around 300 ceramic mason jar sealers that we were able to find. And that's not counting all the ones that are embedded in his pantries. If you added those in, we'd be getting up around, I don't know, 500, 600, 700 sealers. Now, they were sealers full of every imaginable fruit and vegetable, not to mention a surprising variety of other objects. Snow, we've got mixed pickles, Christmas borscht, jelly beans, we've got, we also saw fish, Kool-Aid, Valentine's hearts, and my favorite, logs, because you know logs are the secret ingredient in log jam. Go ahead, grow on. These ones even had a little bit of beaver spittle in them, I'm pretty sure. Their ubiquity and accessibility has sometimes meant that the sealers have been overlooked, I think. They're seen as a friendly work that harks back to a simpler time. But looking at them individually and in his amazing series of pantries, yeah, there's the log jam, so pile of bones. But looking at them in context, I really felt they deserved a closer look. What are the sources of this image? What accounts for the remarkable staying power as a homegrown prairie icon? And more importantly, how does this image speak to the major issues in Victor's work? Garden, craft, memory, and environment. So one of the key sources is found in memory. And Victor tells this beautiful story of going down into the root cellar, which we see here, and the magical world that he discovered down there. I have that same memory, and I've talked to so many people who remember that. You know, we would be having supper, and after supper, my dad would say, "Well, Tim, why don't you go down to the basement and pick something out for dessert?" So I was the smallest, so that's my job to run downstairs. And there I was with the rows of the sealers. You know, what are we going to have for dessert today? What power for like an 8-year-old? I get to pick dessert. And I had my hierarchy. You know, cherries was number one. If we were out of cherries, it was peaches, and then apricots, and then crab apples, Saskatoons, and then on the very bottom were the plums that my sister canned one summer that were absolutely inedible. Those stayed on the shelf for many years. But it's a common experience and one that connects us to memory. But for Victor, the sealer connects to another layer of memory, which I really find fascinating. And here we have the sealers. And this goes back to his days at the University of California, Davis, where he did his Master of Fine Arts. Davis, aside from having one of the most dynamic ceramic studios in America, and you can see here we've got David Gahuli and Robert Artisan. You see a little, that's Artisan on the left, his advisor, and Gahuli on the right, that big, they're both from behind, but oh well. This is from the MFA exhibition, The Last Picnic, which featured this all-ceramic tree structure in the middle. And you can notice that on the menu that day were buckets of the Colonel's finest. But I was really interested to find out that Davis was an agricultural college in its origins. It was a branch of Berkeley, and if you ever go to Davis or to Sacramento, you'll be shocked if you're from this part of the world. It is flat as a pancake, and it's cropland as far as the eye can see. It really felt eerily familiar when I was down there years ago. So this was also, though, a place where there was a lot of the 60s counterculture ferment. And Victor, talking to him, he had his copy of the Whole Earth Catalogue. This is fall 1968 with that beautiful image of the Earth glowing there. And that little line there, access to tools, which I think is such an interesting phrase. That this was a catalog of products that would help you live sustainably, that would help you to develop your own technologies for survival, rather than relying on big business and the commercial, wider commercial world. You could do it yourself. It was also the place where they had the so-called picnic, and this is the picnic day float from University of California, Davis, the veterinary college. Happiness is the anesthetic. I don't know. And I have to say a shout out to Reagan Moynes, our summer student who helped me put together this presentation. And this picnic day float of a giant cow wandering down the street, and this phrase, "I'd rather fight than switch." I don't know what that means, but it was the picnic which Victor participated in, selling his ceramics. Was evolved into the Whole Earth Festival, and this is like one of the originating moments of the global environmental movement, which he was there. They just and it all started at Davis. Here we go, the Peter Max poster and some of the people speaking around the 68-69 picnic. And it was at this time that Victor encountered a whole kind of environment of people, as he describes, who were fed up with, big agribusiness, Monsanto, and people not knowing where their food came from. And it was an environment that he really felt a connection to. And coming back to Regina in 1970 and getting a job at the university teaching art education, it provided an opportunity to take that experience and recontextualize it. And so in 1974, he and his wife Fran bought a schoolhouse in Craven, Saskatchewan, in the lovely Capel Valley. Here's the schoolhouse, which they fixed up. And in 1974, both Fran and Victor took off a year to live sustainably, to live on the food that they raised. And so they grew a huge garden. Victor talks about Fran doing the heavy-duty canning while he made a 5-gallon pail of sauerkraut. And picked berries. And then also up the hill, Victor built a pigeon coop. And this is on his sister Marianne's land just up the hill. And that winter, the children were treated to a continuous diet of, what do you call it, pheasant or quail? Quail. The kids did, yeah, that's right, yeah. But it was an adventure in living sustainably, living back to the land. But interestingly, and I think that this is really key, is that 60s, 70s environmental movement was interpreted through the eyes of his childhood in Regina's east side, in the Garlic Flats, where people lived that way just because that's how they had lived for centuries. That you think back to my grandmother's garden, it was organic because that's just, everything was organic. And so what he was doing was not, some kind of West Coast hippie fad. It was something that had a lot of much deeper integrity and memory and history attached to it. And it's out of that connection that I think you find one of the mainsprings of Victor's work. And in the sealer, I see the perfect kind of emblem of that understanding. How did it happen? Well, one day Victor was watching Fran canning. He said, well, it would be interesting to make one of those sealers. And she said, well, why don't you? And so there you go. 1978, he makes his first sealer. In 1979, the first pantries. And they were very quickly being sold at first at Keswick Gallery and then at the Susan Whitney Gallery. Susan Whitney and I, and Julia, we spent this wonderful afternoon at the archives going through her sales records because I wanted to know how much they cost. The earliest we could find was $35 for a pint back in 1979. There may have been some for $25 the year before, but that's rumor and myth. So we have a very affordable, democratic object that virtually anybody could buy. And even today, at today's prices, they've not more than doubled in price in real terms, in terms of people's earning power. So it remains that kind of object. And something that helped him sustain himself as an artist. As his professor, Bob Artisan, said, you got to have something available at $100, at $1,000, and at $100,000. And that's how you make a life as an artist. So this was, like for prints, for other artists, Victor had the sealers. So what are they about? What do they connect to? The first thing I'd like to talk about, just briefly, is craft. Going back to his days at the University of Regina with Jack Sears and others, he was continually subverting the expectations of pottery by denying function, gluing cups together so that you couldn't drink out of them, or making pots that he would kick across the floor until they were bruised and beaten. It was really an abuse of craft in some ways, but the sealers are not craft objects per se, but are rooted in craft values of the handmade. And in some ways they're like stand-ins for craft objects. It struck me one day when I was visiting one of the collectors, I thought, this is strange, These sealers you find them in exactly the same places you would find a real sealer of fruit or vegetables. On kitchen counters, above the cabinets, on a shelf somewhere. And I thought, what other art object occupies the same space as the object it represents? It's very strange and I don't know, somehow comforting that you can make an object that takes that. And it's also, I think, a reference to the idea of the tool, going back to the Stuart Brand's Whole Earth Catalogue. There's something about the sealer that references making. What can you do with this? And you see that throughout his work. You have the shovels, you have the chairs. It's always they're things that can do something, and they always point also to me to the future. When you're holding one of those sealers, you're not thinking about the past. Well, you may be thinking about the past, about what you did as a kid, but you're also thinking about the future. What am I going to enjoy out of this beautiful sealer of pickles or different kinds of fruit? So that's one thing I wanted to say. And ultimately, I think the work is about how our actions as individuals and communities can build a sustainable world. The next thing that I think they talk about is about Victor's roots within an immigrant community of, in his case, Romanian Canadians, but also his neighbors from the Czechoslovakia, as it was called, or Ukraine, or Serbia, or Poland, or the whole Eastern European, Central European mix. And I think it's really interesting that you look at his sealers. That let's go back one here. Right. So whenever you look at the sealers, there's something a little different about them. that distinguishes them from the real object. And it has to do with the ring. Now, if you remember, most sealer rings, they're made out of zinc. They're kind of a dull gray. Victor's early experiments used that gray, but he quickly discarded that and started to put a gold luster on the ring. And I asked him, well, why'd you do that? And he says, well, I was thinking about Romanian icons. And so, you know, if we think about the icon as an object, it's surrounded by gold. And that gold signifies something. It signifies something that's precious, something that's holy, something that gives you a spiritual life, that feeds your soul. And for Victor, it's the sealer. And I think that's another encouraging message, but also that links the object back to a deeper and longer history. And occasionally that golden ring, which I think of as the frame of the sealer. You know, if you think about, like that one day I was just thinking about those sealers sitting there, and I thought, if that golden ring is like the icon's frame, maybe it's the frame of the sealer. Maybe we're actually meant to look at them down and into the top of the sealer, because that's actually the portal of use, right? It's through the top. So it signifies, you know, the proper position of address, let's call it, for a sealer. But of course that's foolish, because I mean, we all know it's meant to live in your hand, and there actually is no need for a frame, because the object is itself, you know, its own frame. Because I mean, the pickles are the sealer. They're not in anything; they are the thing. So that I love that contradiction in these. And then occasionally, you know, Victor will break the frame, and the pickles come out into the world, you know, emerging out of the nether world of the root cellar and kiln into our, you know, emerging with their cornucopic bodies into our space. So, and the final thing I want to say, just wrapping up, is about their connection. There you go. Pickles galore. Just love the title of that one. And finally, I want to say that we're talking about environment, and I think that the pickles and the sealers, everything goes a little slower than I want it, a little faster than I want it. There you go. So as we pass the 50th anniversary of the first whole Earth catalogue, the problems of planetary exhaustion and the need for solutions are just as pressing as they were the day that Victor arrived in Davis, California. And so, you know, we've been talking about that, and we have, you know, the 100-mile diet, ethical consumerism, sustainable food production, all these movements. But, you know, there's all the danger, and that these are just reduced to lifestyle alternatives. And it's just as real as the failure of the post-war back to the land movement to sustain its initial momentum. But for Victor, of course, this is more than an aesthetic question. His activity with Grow Regina is a really tangible way that he's addressed these concerns. And you see it here in his pair of laser-cut steel sculptures, which frame the entrance to the Grow Regina garden. And these are called the planters, very appropriately. So the ceramic sealer jar icon emerges from a cultural matrix that I think is particular to Saskatchewan, but has resonance throughout North America and the wider world, containing an older sense of value, one extending through the deep history of peasant agriculture and its connections to religion, community, and the rhythms of nature. But at the same time, they offer a view of the future as seen from Davis, California, an optimistic, do-it-yourself environmentalism that puts the dictum, think globally, act locally, into practice. Made with a gardener's care, the sealer is an artwork that lives in the hand and in the heart, a true whole earth Romanian icon. So at this point, I'll invite Victor to come up, and we'll have a couple of questions. Trevor, you're here. Yeah, we'll get set up here.
Where do you want me to sit? Right there. I haven't got my other glasses. I'll just put that in my pocket. My eyes. My eyes. Sure. So is this on? Yes. Well, I want to make sure I'm being heard.
I thought we'd start with Trevor. You have a question.
Yeah. Vic, as a writer and someone who thinks about social, political, environmental issues a lot, I always struggle with how do we present the ideas, right? And you've got a way of doing your political or social commentary that's playful. And I'm curious about that. It's in all of your work. Where does that come from? Both the social and political commentary, and then that decision to do it in that less didactic, or more playful way. And how does your experience as a kid growing up in East Regina?
I think that probably comes from growing up in the Garlic Flats. Things were a lot different back then. It was kind of if you were East European, you weren't really a first-class citizen. You were maybe a second or third-class citizen. And the only way you really dealt with that was to create something humorous about the life you were living and about the people who thought they were better. I had a lot of experiences when I was a kid. I remember in grade 7, for example, having this puppy love affair with a little English girl that sat in front of me, And one day she said, "Let's sit on the step." They were living in a house on Wallace Street, and we sit on the step and we're talking. And her mother calls her in and says, "Who's that sitting on the step?" And she said, "Well, that's Victor. He's in my class." "Victor who?" "Victor Cicansky." "Well, you shouldn't be playing with him because he's not one of our kind." And it was that kind of thing, that we, I'd go home and I'd tell my parents, my mother would rough my hair. She says, "It's all right. In the end, we're all the same, and you'll just be fine." So it was those kinds of experiences, and things like my dad always had a good sense of humor. He worked in construction, and usually the people in construction would complain about these East Europeans eating garlic. Because if you eat raw garlic, it keeps you healthy during any major bacterial event in the community. Eating a clove of garlic is like antibiotic, so these people would eat garlic regularly. If you got into the streetcar in Regina, you could smell the garlic. And I used to call it the Garlic Flats streetcar, which is how we eventually called the area we lived in. And what my dad would do is he would take garlic when the boss wasn't looking and smear it on the steering wheel. So it was those kinds of things that you did, what helped you survive the odd issues of a colonial society, which was this was supposed to be a British colony, and East Europeans were not initially welcome. But that all changed. It all changed with first generation East Europeans and progressive Anglo-Saxons who voted Tommy Douglas' government into power. And it was the Tommy Douglas government that in 1947 that enacted the first Bill of Rights in Saskatchewan. That we're all alike. You can't discriminate against language or ethnicity or color or sex or the rest of it. So that's really what made the big difference for me, and I think for the rest of us, and which made Saskatchewan the most progressive province in North America. A lot of the best ideas I like to say, have come from this province. Things have changed in the last couple of decades, unfortunately. But
that's where that politics comes from for you, is it?
The what?
In a sense, that's where, in your background, just being from a marginalized part of Regina, that's where your kind of political critique and social ideas came from, I guess.
Yeah, you had to become political. I mean, I remember as a kid, joining the youth CCF wing, and I figured, if you're going to change things, you got to get involved. Try to understand the attitudes that were out there, and try to find something humorous about it.
So, Victor, that's interesting about that political background. I'm interested in what you consider to be some of the successes and failures of the environmental movement today, coming out of the 1970s, back to the land movement and counterculture.
Holy moly. Well, the science of climate change has been there for a long time, several decades actually, and not much has been done about it. And I think probably because the United States was the biggest economy, and since the Reagan years, things started to change. With the philosophy of people like Ayn Rand, who said, propagated the idea that selfishness was good, and you never worried about the environment or what was happening to it, but you worried about yourself. I think that permeated, the political system in the United States to a big way, and of course that spills over in other countries, certainly in Canada. For example, we still our government takes our tax dollars and spends it, and they still fund the fossil fuel industry at $3 billion a year. Why aren't we spending $3 billion a year on sustainable energy projects, solar and geothermal? The University of Regina actually had one of the first geothermal wells, several decades ago when it was, when the buildings were first built. So there are lots of things that could be done, but we're not doing them. For some reason, people don't want to talk about climate change. And I contend that, as an individual, you have to do something. And for me, it's gardening. If millions of people started to garden, dig up their lawns, like they're doing, for example, in places like Texas, digging up lawns and planting vegetable gardens, and they look spectacular. Things begin to change. And I think there is a movement growing, especially in California, with the wildfires that, the last couple of years, and there's a movement growing that people are really concerned and they want to get something done. Where it goes, I don't know. I hope it leads us somewhere where we take real action to deal with. The other problem is political. It's always political. The people at the top, the 1%, with the control system, who've learned how to game the political system. And make it difficult for people who want to change things, and that's a tough role for most people. What's happened in the past, for example, during the French Revolution, when people wanted to change things, they got the pitchforks out and to change things.
Time for pitchforks.
So maybe we just open it up to the floor if there's any questions that. Yes.
I have one, Vic. You've obviously done some more research rather than just growing up where you did. And you felt like a second-class citizen relative to some Anglo-Saxons and other people. What was the perception in your community and your family of the First Nations people when you were living there?
You have to speak a little louder.
Yeah, so thanks for that question, Neil. So he's asking what your family's perception of the First Nations people were when you were growing up.
Well, when we were growing up, there was a Métis family who lived next door, and Mabel became a really good friend of our family. She was a part Cree, part English, and her husband was a carpenter, and my dad and he worked together. So we kind of grew up together. There was another family, the Dieter family, that lived about a block and a half away, and the Dieters had sent their kids to the city to be educated, and Lawrence and I ended up in the same in grade 9 at Balfour Tech Collegiate. So we became good buddies. He'd come over to my place. I'd go out to the reserve with him on weekends, and we'd stay with his grandmother. I learned a little bit of Cree. I learned how to say "Betsina Wapus," pass the rabbit.
That's important.
Yeah, well, we'd be out there shooting the rabbits, and we'd bring them home, and his grandmother would cook this incredible stew of rabbit, and so we and every year we had a family from Musquepiton who came in with a load of wood. They'd have to get permission from the superintendent of the reserve, an Anglo-Saxon, somebody or other, in order to leave the reserve to sell a load of wood to somebody in the city. And that was always picnic day for us, because my mother would cook a big meal. They'd put down blankets, they'd unload the wood, and we'd sit down and visit and eat the food, and that would happen every year. So we always had a connection. I think attitudes were different back then towards Aboriginal people, towards Indigenous people, and then things changed afterwards. I know when I was talking to Lawrence, he had after he graduated, I quit school in grade 9. He finished and applied for a job in Regina as a policeman. It was so racist that he just quit and went to reserve. But those things have changed, fortunately. It's taken a long time, and there's still much to do. But our relationship was always, there were just other people living in the community, and you worked together.
Well, I think maybe we'll just keep things moving along, but we'll have another chance to hear from Victor after the next set of talks. And we'll have a little bit longer time to ask questions, so if you have a burning question, you can hold it till then. So right now, if you want, stand, stretch while we get set up for our next group of speakers, and I'll turn things over to Julia.
You've learned something.
Okay, if everybody would like to take their seats, we're going to push forward here because we've just got such a full schedule on our plates here that we want to keep going. So this next part, part 2, is we're calling Troubling Paradise. And in this section, we're going to explore how Victor Cicansky has challenged and expanded the definitions of folk, craft, and prairie through his murals, furniture, and sculptures. Just hang on, I have to get my... Our first speaker in this section will be Susan Surette, who's traveled here from Montreal to be with us today, so we're very happy about that. Susan Surette received her PhD from Concordia University in Montreal in 2014, and in 2016 completed a 2-year SSHRC-funded postdoctoral fellowship at NSCAD University in Halifax. She is currently writing a book on Canadian ceramic murals of the second half of the 20th century, as well as co-editing Craft and Heritage, Intersections in Discourse and Practice. She is a regular participant in national and international conferences, and as a part-time faculty member at Concordia University, she is passionate about teaching ceramic, textile, and craft histories. Please join me in welcoming Susan Surette.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I...
Just wait 1 second.
Sorry.
It's the other presentation.
That's not me.
I was up there, but now...
I'd like to thank Timothy and Julia and the Mackenzie Art Gallery for inviting me today. And most of all, I'd like to thank Victor for producing such wonderful work to talk about. It's really an honor, and I'm always really excited to think about and talk about and write about Victor's work. So today my talk is called Victor Cicansky's Fine Folk. Victor Cicansky's folks were always fine. These rural newcomers just took the art establishment by surprise when they first turned up in the sturdy stone center, a modernist government building, with their animals, grains, working hands, and strange foods and clothes. Moreover, they rather impertinently looked down upon those who were closely examining them. They were not really grotesque caricatures or marvelous gargoyles or Bruegel-esque distortions as depicted in the press, nor were they just people who someone suggested oozed fecundity. Indeed, only a few years later, the children of these same folks appeared on the 9th floor of that building, carefully delimited within tondo frames that celebrated the tools of their trade. These urban workers in the economic and social mainstream demonstrated to the same public their diligence, hard work, and sociability. Reviewers of the period were quick to admire and to express some degree of consternation about the old working class and the new working class. And indeed, when writing about Victor's sculptures, often remarked on their similarity to folk art. I argue that Victor Cicansky's folk are fine, and that the fine folk tension is embedded in interpretations of class and ethnicity, framed within the socio-economic and political challenges of the late 1970s, when they were created and installed. As Canadian art historian Annie Guérin suggests, Canadian public artworks are best appreciated as agents in the struggle over space, identity, economy, and politics that shape Canada. Victor's murals broke the established rules about what mid-century public art in Canada was supposed to look like. They broke it because they were made of ceramics, about immigrant working-class people, and importantly because they made viewers think of folk art and distorted bodies. Coincidentally or not, this was also a time in Saskatchewan when the political class was breaking rules with a socialist agenda to transform the economic and social landscape of the province. On an international scale, these murals overlapped with an avant-garde and disruptive California funk clay movement. Victor had been exposed to and influenced by Robert Arnison's funky figure. Oh my goodness, I'm not changing this. Ooh, sorry. Okay. There we go. And now we're on to Robert Arnison. Funky figurative ceramic sculpture that challenged hierarchies in the art world regarding mediums and visual vocabularies. This funk clay movement exposed power struggles between the art establishment of the east coast of North America and regional voices, such as those found in California. The work of Arnison and his colleagues, like the path followed by Victor, was humorous, pointed, and often biographical. It celebrated personal narratives that were embedded within larger political and social concerns. On a national scale, the murals intersected with the new Canadian agenda of multiculturalism that was being debated and implemented. With the federal government's 1971 Canadian Multiculturalism Act, the acceptance and celebration of cultural differences was legislatively entrenched. It clearly signaled that it was time to move away from the anti-immigrant rhetoric spouted by some intolerant and fearful British Canadians of a few decades earlier that had plagued Eastern European newcomers. This policy shift created new audience for artists such as Victor and the painter William Kurelik, along with writers such as Myrna Kostash, who explored their multicultural prairie identities. The Saskatchewan government quickly embraced this recognition of cultural diversity. Called the birthplace, in fact, if not in name, of multiculturalism, Saskatchewan was the first province to adopt a Multiculturalism Act in 1974. Echoes of this policy can also be heard in its 1986 official model, From Many People's Strength. The old working class and the new working class murals embodied the entanglement of class and ethnicity. While the very titles of these government commission works focus on class, their Eastern European ethnicity is proclaimed by unmistakable markers: a prominent and defiant garlic sausage, an older woman in a headscarf, an onion-patterned fence, challah bread, cabbage rolls, and an Orthodox cross. The murals call attention to how art styles and materials not only are used to categorize class, but also can be harnessed to confront cultural, social, and political power structures. Victor is clear about how he regards public art. Quote, "Public art in contemporary society is a reminder of our values and who we are. It should be meaningful and accessible. It should enhance the visual landscape and stimulate the imagination of people in the communities where art is placed." Unquote. The terracotta figures command respect through their sheer size and high relief. Not to be ignored, these complex, dynamic, wrinkled, and weathered people make us literally and figuratively look up to them. In the public space of the Sturdy Stone Center, they are accessible to a broad audience, some of whom are sure to be descendants, friends, and neighbors of these pioneers, while their presence in a provincial government building proclaims their contribution to the body politic of Saskatchewan. Media reviews compared the reliefs to the early 20th century American muralist paintings of Thomas Hart Benton, known for his celebration of Midwestern pioneers and rural workers of the Great Depression, and to the 16th century paintings of the Netherlandish Peter Bruegel. Considered marginal within the art historical canon because they consciously developed regional aesthetic vocabularies, playing on the borders of folk art, Bruegel and Benton were then each being reevaluated as to how they may have contributed to a national artistic legacy. According to art historians and reviewers, the works of these two painters blurred the lines between caricature and portraiture. This indeterminacy is also evident in the figures of the old working class. Seen in details such as the intimate winks, sidelong glasses, and scowls of these inquisitive, resigned, and mischievous faces, accentuated by the individualistic and quizzical expressions of the dogs and other animals. The challenge in reading aesthetic vocabularies that fall outside the art canon is that difference is often initially perceived as ludicrous and incongruous. Like the painters to which he was compared, Victor has carefully documented the details of rural labor so that it cannot be effaced. Every rock and log that had to be moved for cultivation is rendered with singular form and texture. Corn husks and corn kernels are individualized, as are the flowering ends of every tomato and the eyes of each potato. The wrinkled textures of cabbages indicate their variety, and the shapes of the zucchinis hint at their growing conditions. Wooden planks with their specific grain patterns, nail holes, and knots remind us of the effort of building. Split cedar baskets and barrels, basket-woven containers, and thickly coiled rope suggest historical textile techniques. The rough texture of burlap bags make us aware of weaving, and the metal pots with conspicuously riveted handles recall the practices of tinkers. These details highlight the intense effort of the settler generation. Like Bruegel's allegories, the old working class celebrates labor and abundance while suggesting serious issues of class, labor, and ethnicity through an emphasis on material culture and human interaction. Like Benton's Depression murals, these ceramic figures honor the emotional complexity of hard work, joy, social tension, humor, and fatigue. Growing up in the rich cultural milieu of Regina's Garlic Flats, an area populated predominantly by Eastern European immigrants, Victor's interest in folk art was topical and personal, especially through his knowledge of his father's own practice. In the 2 decades prior to these mural projects, folk art had been celebrated in Saskatchewan as an alternative to the Eastern North American-dominated abstract expressionist movement. At the national level, curator Nora McCullough promoted prairie folk art with the 1959 National Gallery of Canada exhibition, Folk Painters of the Canadian West. Folk art was supported through acquisitions by the Norman Mackenzie Art Gallery and the Saskatchewan Arts Board, as well as exhibitions at the Dunlop Art Gallery and later the Susan Whitney Gallery. While folk art was being carefully integrated into the Saskatchewan art scene, recognition at the national level was tainted by a sense of mockery and disparagement. With the inclusion of a backward S in painters, you can see it barely here, in McCullough's exhibition catalogue that signaled some level of illiteracy or learning challenge, along with contradictory remarks in the accompanying catalogue texts that praised artistic excellence, even while commenting on the work's simplicity, innocence, and lack of sophistication. In the 1970s, many of Saskatchewan's academically trained artists embraced the art of those non-academically trained. Figurative small-scale folk art-based sculptures representing rural Saskatchewan life and its people, including those by Victor, were the only ceramics included in the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris exhibition Canada Trajectoire 73, organized by the Canada Council. In 1976, artist David Thoberger curated a Mackenzie Gallery exhibition, Grassroots Saskatchewan. And that same year, a folk art-inspired multimedia collaborative installation, The Grain Bin, that brought together non-academically and academically trained artists, represented the province at the 1976 Montreal Olympics. Concurrently, a general interest in folk art gave rise to several American and Canadian conferences and publications, some of which indicated an increasing awareness of issues that extended beyond collectors' aesthetic concerns to recognize and examine social and political issues of class and ethnicity. The 1977 Windturther Folk Art Conference and Exhibition initiated provocative and critical discussions around the roles played by ethnicity and class in the categorization of folk art, issues that are particularly relevant in Victor's murals from that time. Even clay as a material for public figurative sculptures evoked the vernacular. As a choice, it challenged expectations of public art at a time when carved stone or metal were privileged. Ceramics was certainly considered less noble. The unglazed old working class conspicuously celebrated its lack of nobility, its commonness, boldly referring to the earth with which the settlers worked. The new working class continued this challenge of material hierarchies through their bright, low-fired commercial glazes associated with hobbyists that upended the modernist dictum of truth to materials and the privilege accorded to high-fired glazed studio pottery prevalent among studio potters and their organizations. The vernacular materials, along with the vernacular subject matter and visual vocabulary, spoke about working class people and to working class people. Whereas some of the ceramic murals on and in the Sturdy Stone Center could be understood as an attempt to educate the public in the vocabulary of abstract modernism. These figurative and narrative murals serve to educate the cultural elite in the people's art. However, because Victor effectively blended recognizable art influences that appealed to this cultural elite, such as the clay relief sculptures of the Della Robbia family of the Florentine Renaissance, and a narrative focus inspired by Trajan's column, he was able to build bridges. What the cultural elite struggled with was the folksiness of the folk. The association of folk with the cultural other, either class or ethnic based, certainly complicated the reception of these very much admired murals that provocatively reframed how nobility in public art might be created. The Sturdy Stone Mural Commission was Victor's first opportunity for monumental public sculpture that would address a wide audience. Vivacious and congenial, loving and thoughtful, the figures in the old working class and the new working class embrace the hopefulness of folk visual vocabularies and subject matter, while subtly questioning prejudices that fuel ethnic and class difference. Victor's own history positioned him as an insider within the community he was representing, legitimating the mural's voices. As art historian Mi-Wan Kwan suggests, the success of a site-specific project depends upon its positive reflection of those who are involved with it. Community is built through the affirmation of self rather than confrontation and disturbance. Victor's murals fulfilled a dual function. While affirming the cultural other, they necessarily confronted the establishment's expectations about public figurative art. Created at a time when multiculturalism was a nascent force in Saskatchewan and Canada, an inspirational ideal, these murals are a reminder of the complex processes encountered by migrant peoples, a message still very relevant today. These lively, humorous, and thought-provoking public murals provide a space to consider how public art might serve as a site for working through struggles around cultural, economic, and political identities. Their sensitive portrayals of human and non-human encounters suggest the abundance of the human spirit, while acknowledging the challenges faced by immigrants. Victor sculpted murals in folk, of folk, and for all the folk in the Sturdy Stone Centre, a site which depended and still depends on the labor and support of the people. Canadian art historian JRN claims memory in the guise of public art always looks forward. The old working class and the new working class evoke memories of the settlers' challenges as they encountered a new society and the ideals of multiculturalism, and provoke discussions about the limits of class and ethnicity. They encourage us to reflect today on our own changing socio-political landscape, while their message of adoption and adaptation, abundance and humor, labor and joy, compassion and mutual respect can carry us into the future. Victor has given us fine folk.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Susan. So now I'm going to give the presentation, the next one. And I won't introduce myself, I'll just jump right in. So thank you all so much for coming here today. And I'm going to open my talk in true Victor Cicansky fashion with a story. This story begins with an invitation. On May 14th, 1997, Victor sent an invitation and a personal note to the curator of contemporary art at the National Gallery of Canada by the name of Diana Nemiroff, inviting her to view his solo exhibition, The Heart of the Garden, at the Mira Goddard Gallery in Toronto. After spending a summer in northern Saskatchewan, he was eager to share with the National Gallery a new rugged complexity within his bronzes that had resulted from a deeper understanding of material in place. In July, Cicansky received a short reply from Janice Celine, Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art, and I quote, "Diana Nemiroff has asked me to reply to your letter, as she is traveling for an extended period. I did happen to be in Toronto before it opened, and I glimpsed it being unpacked. I'm sorry to say that our collection and your work would seem to have taken different paths, and that this state of affairs is likely to continue, given the limitations of our purchase program." Ouch, hey? But Victor's not to be deterred, okay? Later that month, Victor sent another letter to Nemiroff asking for a clarification on Celine's use of the word path. Quote, "Perhaps you could provide me with the corporate policy that articulates the path the gallery is on and your interpretation of how this path diverges from my own. I would also be most interested in your analysis on what path you believe my work has taken." Nemiroff replied in August and articulated the gallery's path in relation to photography, film, race, gender, the interrelationship of different cultures, high, low, Western, non-Western, representational critique, and questions of fate, of place, followed by a description of Cicansky's path. And I quote, "I see your work is essentially bucolic, occasionally humorous, and coming out of and giving expression to the rural or agrarian side in what we might describe as a rural-urban split." Again, ouch. In October, Cicansky replied to Nemiroff and took issue with her characterization of his work as bucolic and agrarian by pointing out that his work was about his experiences growing up in the East End of Regina. And I quote, "While it is true Singing the Joys of an Agrarian Society was a title I used for a work from the Outhouse series I created in the early 1970s, it was a tongue-in-cheek title. It was inspired by the outhouse we used when I was a boy." He also pointed out that his garden is an urban one and not something found in the country. He closed by politely declining an offer that Nemiroff had made to visit his studio, conceding that, I quote, "My work is not compatible with the current collecting strategies of the National Gallery." Cicansky was right in terms of compatibility. Craft and art in the 1990s were divided and defined by materials: clay, glass, fiber, wood, and certain metals, and types of objects: functional, domestic, and decorative. Art galleries were for art, and museums were for craft and other forms of material culture. In fact, this division can be seen by way of the National Gallery and the Museum of History, divided by a river to this day. Craft on one side of the river, over in Quebec, in the museum, and art on the other side, in the National Gallery, almost adjacent to the Parliament buildings. In Cicansky's case, the curators of the National Gallery, I'm arguing here, could not look past his material roots in clay and the functional nature of his work, even though the Heart of the Garden, that Mira Goddard exhibition, included a number of sculptural bronze bonsais. This narrow view meant that they ultimately ghettoized his work as craft. But what about craft? Could it in fact be a useful tool? I'd like to, for the remainder of this talk, take up this question of craft, to travel down a crafted path, so to speak, to theorize by way of craft some key works of Victor's. I've come to believe that craft might very well be a productive way of thinking through Cicansky as a maker and artist. It makes sense to do this as Cicansky's roots are craft-based. He did, after all, take pottery courses from Patricia Lee Weens, Beth Hone, and Jack Sears at the University of Saskatchewan Regina campus, and studied under the influential funk and nut ceramist Robert Artisan at the University of California, Davis. While working on this project over and over again, I was struck by Victor's sustained engagement with material on a physical and metaphorical level, which is a defining act of a craft person. His decades-long engagement with material also mirrors the ever-evolving definition of craft in North America since the Second World War, from types of objects made of certain materials to a way of doing and being in this world. And it's important to note here that one can be many things at once, including you can be a craftsperson and an artist. You can be a craftsperson and a designer. You don't have to be one and the other. You can become them all, okay? I would also go so far as to argue that in light of the expanded definition of craft as a way of doing things, Victor Cicansky as craftsperson really sheds light on just how politically subversive, difficult to place, and powerfully effective his work is, ultimately making Victor one heck of an interesting and influential figure within the Regina Clay story. So for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to focus on two series of works, and I'm going to try to theorize them by way of craft theory. And the first one I'm going to talk about are his outhouses. Victor grew up in Germantown, which occupied the east end of the city and was mainly populated by non-Anglo-Saxon people of German, Hungarian, and Romanian descent. In terms of basic infrastructure, such as running water, sewer, and garbage pickup, the city neglected this area, and it did not get adequate services until well into the 20th century, which meant that people used outhouses. And as a 14-year-old boy, Victor started a business called the Garlic Flats Syndicate, building these structures for his neighbors. It would not be out of place, though, to attribute this neglect of infrastructure to race and class. And I've included here a photo of a house from Germantown in 1927, and in the records it's actually noted that that white piece of paper is an insanitary notice that was placed on the house. I mean, it's difficult to look at that, right? And then somebody went in and recorded that. And a house that was built in 1912 to just show you the difference in terms of the type of standard of living that was happening within this city. Let's now dive a bit into ceramic theory. Oh boy. A fossil is a remnant, impression, or trace of an organism of past geologic ages that has become preserved in the Earth's crust. Clay is of the earth, and once it is fired, it becomes preserved as ceramic. This is ceramic theory. This is something ceramics can do that no other material can, and ceramics get really excited about stuff like this, okay? Making permanent, once it's made into ceramic, all the fingerprints and marks that are left behind on the material. The marks are, so to speak, fossilized. Now, a radioactive fossil, to borrow from the work of Laura U. Marks and Gilles Deleuze, is an object associated with a memory that has been forgotten. And when that object enables the memory to resurface, it's radioactive. Because of the radioactivity of this object that comes again to the surface and makes you remember something that you forget, mutates or changes your understanding of, let's say, history. Radioactive fossils are disquieting. They're strange and stubborn, as they arise from a past that might not quite match our current understanding of said past. Cicansky's outhouses, I argue, are radioactive fossils. Each outhouse is a miniaturized ruin that is associated with a variety of memories, both good and bad. Today, no outhouses remain in Germantown, effectively erasing a part of Regina's past that othered and suppressed a specific area of the city by way of water politics, of politics around sanitation, for instance. And it was an area of the city that was filled with people of non-Anglo backgrounds. By fossilizing his memory of the outhouses in East End Regina in the form of a ceramic miniature, he makes visible something that has effectively been erased or sanitized from our urban landscape. Like an archaeologist, Victor unearths the metaphorical midden heaps of Regina's buried past. But Victor pushes the radioactivity a step further by referencing the history of ceramics. Can you see how much these two pieces look alike? And in fact, I found a slide of this object in Victor's slide collection, so we know he was looking at these objects. This is a perfume burner that was made for the 18th century very rich clients and was ideally placed within a ladies' dressing room. There's one for sale right now, $80,000 for anyone who's interested, okay? That's the level of, even today, how sort of elevated these things are, okay? So these were to go in a ladies' dressing room to give, the sweet smells, etc. Both objects represent various forms of local architecture and smells. In this case, perfume versus excrement. Now think about the radioactivity of singing the joys of an agrarian society. Balanced precariously atop a pile of refuse, complete with rotting vegetables and ceramic turds, so funky and a la Artisan, yet it looks like a luxurious piece of porcelain. Now look closely at what's inside that outhouse. It's a fountain, gushing beautiful blue clear water. In his correspondences with Nemiroff, Cicansky stated that the fountain was inspired by the Trafalgar Fountain in Wascana Park. A gift from colonizer to colony. So again, referencing back to water politics and how it relates to race. With its ceramic sources being the material of the culture of the elite, luxury in the form of sweet smells and white gold, which is porcelain, yet its subject matter being excrement, the handmade, make-do, wooden vernacular buildings and workarounds adopted by a neighborhood neglected by those in power, and all of it expressed via white earthenware rather than porcelain. It is a radioactive fossil that is unsettling. Now let's switch materials and look at wood, bronze, and glass. Bronze has a rich history. The Greek and Roman sculptors used bronze to sculpt likenesses of gods, heroes, and people in positions of power. Consequently, bronze statues are associated with power and divine grandeur, and it's expensive to use. I just take a moment here to mentally imagine Queen Elizabeth made in, wood. Right, the bronze statue here, it would create a different meaning to the piece if she was made out of glass instead, right? When you see bronze equestrian statues, it's going right back to the Roman times, etc., and there's a lot of power dynamics associated with that. After making some bronze sculptures in 1986, Cicansky moved into creating furniture that honors the life of a tree by casting actual pieces of trees in bronze. And you can actually see this in this process photo here of Victor building a bench out of both milled wood and found pieces of wood. His sources for his wood come from local trees as well as other areas that he's visited, such as New Wreck Beach that you'll see upstairs. The wood from there comes from the clothing optional beach at UBC, where Victor first got involved with ceramics. His sources are also very close to him. He really likes the hawthorn tree, for instance, and he's been known to visit the same tree or shrub numerous times in order to get to know it. To many, these pieces of wood, the type of wood that Victor uses and casts in bronze, are little more than kindling, unworthy of memorialization in the same way that the gigantic mythical redwoods of California deserve, or the supposed heroes of our past do. But Victor thinks otherwise, and these branches are the survivors and losers in this age of global warming. This brings us back to that Stony Rapids table which opened this paper. After a difficult period in his personal life, Victor took a trip to northern Saskatchewan where he was really inspired by what he saw. And part of this was because he looked down at the forest floor. This is key, okay? So he looked down at the forest floor and was inspired by what he saw. Although clear glass tabletops did appear before his Stony Rapids trips, glass becomes really important to understanding the conceptual complexity of his work. And you do not experience this with his solid tables, his solid top tables. The glass tabletops enable you to look down and through at the complexity of these garden-like vignettes. Over the course of history, looking through glass by way of telescopes and microscopes has facilitated the discovery of new worlds. And this is a virtual experience. This is the virtuality of glass. I'm now doing some glass theory here. Remember how important looking down at the forest was to Victor, it's the same action as looking down and through a microscope. And with this action of looking down, new worlds are discovered that are framed by glass. Looking down encourages you to enter into a new mental mind space, to become open to the ideas that Victor's proposing. It's important to experience Victor's tables and their virtuality as they are designed to be experienced in relationship to the user, not high up so that they can be photographed or seen from the perfect vantage point. We have a table in the exhibition upstairs in the reading room that you are welcome to engage with, to sit down and look through to the virtual world below. And when you do, notice how you take on the viewpoint of a giant as you look down at the tops of leaves and fruit rather than up at the bottom of them, as you do when you stand on the ground underneath a large tree. Yet the leaves, in relation to you, are not miniaturized, complicating the positioning of the viewer as a giant. In addition, these pieces are activated in the home when in use, and less so in a gallery setting when on display, which might be why Nemiroff didn't see how they would fit within the National Gallery. Victor's tables virtually and poetically, by way of material, coax the user to consider nature and one's relationship and responsibility to this earth as human beings. We are all gardeners. Encountering Victor's lifetime of work using a craft line path weaves a complexity into his practice and illustrates his deep understanding of his chosen materials. As discussed, Nemiroff's declaration that Cicansky's work had taken a different path from the galleries was more than likely based on an art versus craft bias. However, by the early 2000s, with the ever-expanding definition of craft and perhaps a reevaluation of the gallery's path, it did purchase two examples of Victor's work, February Pantry and Dining on Peaches and Pears. And we are lucky enough to have upstairs in the gallery the Peaches and Pears table for you to look at. Yet curiously, the pantry and dining table are categorized under sculpture in the gallery's database. This is somewhat plausible for February Pantry, but Dining on Peaches and Pears is quite obviously an example of Canadian studio furniture. What makes this categorization even more revealing is the fact that Donald Judd's double bench, and unfortunately I don't have a picture of that because there isn't one on the National Gallery's database, but I've given you another one of his benches, is categorized in that same database as decorative arts, leading me to speculate that craft is still a troublesome path for many art institutions. However, maybe that is exactly what makes craft and the work of makers such as Victor Cicansky so appealing and potent. The most interesting objects are those that can't be easily categorized and cultivate within the user and viewer multiple meanings. Thank you, Victor, very much for your work. Thank you. Okay, I'm back again. Now I have the pleasure of introducing, wait, do I have it on here?
Oh, yeah.
There we go, Allison Calder, sorry, who's come to us all the way from Winnipeg, so we're very happy to have her here. Allison Calder grew up in Saskatoon and now lives in Winnipeg, where she teaches Canadian literature and creative writing at the University of Manitoba. She has published widely on Canadian prairie literature and culture and is especially proud of her article on the cultural significance of gophers. She is also an award-winning poet. Please join me in welcoming Allison Calder.
Thanks very much, Julia. You're a hard act to follow. I'd like to open by thanking Timothy, Julia, and all the Mackenzie Gallery folk for putting on this show. It's such a wonderful thing to be able to see such beautiful pieces as they're meant to be seen, or at least one of the ways they're meant to be seen, and it's a real pleasure to be able to do that. Now, I'm a literary scholar, so Julia's invitation to participate in this project gave me the opportunity to think about prairie art in different ways than I usually do, and it was really a lot of fun. And I think when I'm talking, you're going to be able to hear, at least I hope, some of the humor in Victor's work coming through, and also the ways in which the various panelists' talks, I think, dovetail in really nice ways, or maybe dove coop in nice ways, or pigeon coop in nice ways, too. So I have two warnings to begin with, though. The first one is that I'm going to say a bad word, so listen carefully, because you don't want to miss it. And even worse, I'm going to talk about poetry. So take a deep breath, it's gonna be fine. So I was really interested in Julia's description of the National Gallery's negative response to Victor's work, because it really closely replicates the experience actually of many prairie writers as well. And this is sort of the, if you're so good, why are you still in Saskatchewan syndrome, which some of us may be familiar with. And it really is based on the assumption that work from the prairies is really of only limited interest. It's always about farming, which is always seen as really, boring and tedious and so on. And that work that comes out of this place is much less valuable and less interesting and complicated than work that comes out of Toronto or Montreal. And I think we can argue certainly against that. And this, unfortunately, this is still true, although the situation is changing. So I want to open with a very brief discussion of another very limited, bucolic, agrarian work of only regional interest. You've probably never heard of it. It's a very simple little ditty. It's called The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams. And I'm just going to read it out loud. It's very short, and if you know it, feel free to recite it along. So The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams. He says, the poem says, "So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens." And that's the entirety. So this is one of the most iconic poems of the 20th century, right? It's widely anthologized. It's a monument of literary modernism. And it could actually, very easily be a description of one of Victor's pieces, right? We have the same kind of vividness there, the same kind of concentration of ideas, right, into this in Williams's case, this very tiny poem. And the key to this poem, to Williams's poem here, is the very first stanza, right? So much depends upon the wheelbarrow, because it really sets us up for that question. And the question is what? Like, what depends upon the wheelbarrow? What depends upon the chickens? What depends upon the rain, right? Or even perhaps what depends upon the poem? And this really is a fundamental question, and we can answer it in a variety of different ways. We can think about labor, we can think about economics, we can think about class, we can think about sustenance, or we can even think about life itself in all kinds of different ways. So suddenly, like this wheelbarrow opens outward. It's like a kaleidoscope that refracts everything in a multitude of different ways. So really it can carry anything, that wheelbarrow. And I think by turning his attention to similar things, like shovels or vegetables, Victor's also opening the world to this kind of scrutiny, right? Because turning words into poems makes us read those words differently. Poetic language is different than the regular language we use all the time. So turning words into poems makes words different, right? And turning vegetables or skulls into art does the same kind of thing. It makes them different. And we can think about this in our consideration of medium as well as the actual content, right? So not only the sculpture or not only the apple, let's say, but also what the apple's made of. So this is a very, I think, poetic way of looking at the world, right? And Canadian poet Tim Lilburn talks about the importance of contemplation, right? The ways in which we need to sort of contemplate the world. And poet Don Mackay talks about poetic attention, right? Turning poetic attention onto the things of the world. And so what does this mean? Well, let me give you a short example. This is a poem by, the very first part of a poem by Erin Murray, also a Canadian poet, and it's called Homage to the Mineral of the Onion. And she says, the poem says, "In the onion, there's something of fire, that fire known as fog. The onion is the way fog has of entering the earth, into the soil, through the green leaves of the onion." Okay, so now what does this mean? Well, actually, I don't know. I don't know what that means, but I think about it every time I chop onions. And in a way, that poem has focused my attention on that onion. It has transformed that experience into something which is more than that simple act. And that, I think, is the kind of attention that Victor invites us to focus, right, on the things of the world that he's treating, I guess, in the way that he does. When I look at one of Victor's sealers, for example, I think, who made this? Why did they make it? What did they make it for? And when I go out into the world and look at other sealers, real ones, right? I can also say, like, who made this? Where did it come from? Like, what depends on this, in a sense? And I think that's really interesting. So I think Victor's eye is a very poetic one. And I think it's very important to place his work in a specific historical and geographic context, which doesn't limit it in any way, but which really situates it in a way that lets complexities be recognized. So on the prairies, everything is about land, right? Who has it, who wants it, who gets to be here, and who gets called a trespasser, right? It all comes back to land. But given that the majority of people now live in urban environments, and given changing technologies and sort of community boundaries, and given diversity of new immigration patterns, and given as well sort of a recognition of the rightful place of Indigenous people who were displaced by the same men and women who we also celebrate as heroic pioneers, right? Our relationship to land has undergone huge changes since the early days of settlement and colonization. And so Victor's work is gorgeous. Like, it's just beautiful. And the kind of harvest it evokes may be part of a regional ethos, right, that imagines itself rooted in a simpler, less complicated time. And this is a bit perilous, right, because nostalgia for this very idea of the simple past, right, can soon be transformed into a dangerously exclusive nationalism. But again, we need to look at specifics, right? And Victor's relationship to nostalgia is complicated by factors of ethnicity, class, and gender that are very specific to the prairies. So vegetables, for example, may seem neutral, but they're markers of very particular social structures. So you can think about, for example, today, where are grocery stores located, right? Who has access to them? And if you live in the inner city, what kind of food are you allowed to get, right? So food is a very important signifier of all kinds of social webs, I guess. So it's possible, I think, to be blinded almost by the gorgeousness of Victor's work. And if I ever write a book about Victor, I will call it Blinded by Gorgeousness. It's possible to be blinded by gorgeousness, but a deeper reading that places his work in a prairie-specific context suggests that these works are, in fact, deeply involved with the politics of place. Now, there's nothing natural about the prairie. And when I say that, I'm talking about the idea of the prairie as a notion, right? The prairie as a colonial construct. I'm not talking about the actual landscape and its inhabitants, right, which of course are out there. But the prairie itself as an idea is nothing, it's not natural at all, right? It's an imagined construct that has traditionally been conceived of as white, masculine, Northern European, usually British space. Now, the speakers we've already heard, including Victor, right, have already touched on the way that his work comes out of an ethnic past that used to be sort of despised by decent people, right, second class, perhaps third class citizens there, because this ethnic past, right, is a reminder of what Canadians sought to expel from this place where we are now. But I think like the gorgeousness of Victor's pieces really disguise their subversiveness, right? Because they reinscribe this ethnic heritage that the Canadianizing of the prairies sought to eradicate. And so in a sense, I think the beauty of these pieces is both a blessing and a curse, right? Because the beautiful jar in the present may allow the forgetting of a violent past, and further, it may function as a sign that allows its owner to appropriate its sort of sense of wholesomeness, right? Its sense of goodness, into a prairie self-image that masks race, class, and gendered privilege. And I think that Victor's works occupy these mutually conflicting positions simultaneously. I say a sculpted artichoke is both a comforting harvest and a hand grenade.
I like that.
So I want to think about, let's move away from that image and think about fun, right? Because the prairie is not supposed to be fun. Right? Much canonical prairie fiction, for example, has been read as, I quote, the record of man's response to the emptiness, to the hollowness so often found at the core of life, to the void beyond, which is death. So the prairie is a bit of a bummer, really. But I think, when you go upstairs, you can see this very bleak vision challenged, right? Everywhere you look, the exhibit is so vivid, and often it's so funny. And in many cases, this humor comes from disrupting expectations, right? From taking something from one place where it usually lives and putting it somewhere else. In this way, things like the vegetables, for example, erupt out of the category of object and reveal themselves to have an interiority that is very human. And I was thinking when earlier Trevor mentioned the idea of the wild eros of nature, and I think we have that circulating around the exhibit a lot. I'm also reminded of Lorna Crozier's poetic series, The Sex Lives of Vegetables, which opens with the very memorable lines, "Carrots are fucking the earth." That's the bad word. Yeah, so these vegetables upstairs, that Victor's created, really have to be reclassified, right? They don't fit into where they're supposed to fit in on the prairie, because the prairie is founded on the premise that the earth exists as a tool for human advancement, and that plants and animals are objects for consumption. So if I go into the living room and I find a cauliflower sitting in my chair, that's a pretty radical move. A radical replacement of the thing. So, are these vegetables the return of the prairie repressed? Well, that might be a slight overstatement, but I do think they do represent the knowledge that the world is not under human control, right? That it has an existence of its own, that at some level has to be acknowledged. And the humor of this unexpectedness seems built into Victor's work from the very beginning. For example, in the creation of dishes with mouths of their own, right? Which sort of suggests not only a human lack of control over the world, but also a reaction against the idea that everything has to be useful, right? Everything has to perform a service to us to justify its existence. And if we think about the kind of structures or strictures that have sprung up around developing prairie land, we can see this kind of demand for usefulness, this demand that everything can be extracted from, right? We see this trumping everything. Although I must say I hate using that word trump. It does seem appropriate in this case. So now, Victor's work is chaotic and domestic. A lot of prairie iconography is monumental, right? So you can think about grain elevators, vast spaces, rail lines, right? Colonial expansion, capital P progress, all of these sort of huge, huge things. And this monumentalization is paralleled in literature by the figure of the prairie patriarch, who dominates land and family, and who has to battle the land in order to claim his territory. And if you read the novel Wild Geese by Martha Ostenzo, you'll be quite familiar with the figure of this sort of monstrous, almost character who needs to control the land and people around him. And central here are the ideas of combat and control. Okay, so that's supposed to be our relationship with the world, this sort of combative relationship to make it do what we want. Now, Victor's work is different, right? Many of the pieces celebrate randomness, right? And how the natural world actually foils the gardener's expectations. And if you are a gardener, you will know, at least I do as a gardener, that my expectations are pretty much foiled with every turn of the shovel. But certainly, we see this kind of surge of energy, I guess, in much of the work we see upstairs. And I want to quote poet Don Mackay, who redefines the word wilderness. And he describes it as, quote, "the capacity of all things to elude the mind's appropriations," end quote. And he writes that, quote, "the coat hanger asks a question. The armchair is suddenly crouched. In such defamiliarizations, often arranged by art, we enter the momentary circumvention of the mind's categories to glimpse some thing's autonomy, its rawness, its duende, its alien being." And I think we see this kind of movement in Victor's works, right? This defamiliarization of the expected, right? This recategorization or reclassification of the things of the world around us. So we can think, for example, of some of his books, his clay books, right? The Control of Insect Pests, And my favorite, the super control of insect pests, right, which themselves are gnawed by insects, right? They're sort of only half there. The cover's all kind of screwed up there. You can think about his sculptures of houses and outhouses, right? Very disordered, confusing waste and production, like bringing those things together in really confusing ways, let's say. And even things like his planters, right, which some of the first things you see when you go into the exhibit with the plants kind of sprouting haphazardly out of the top of them, right? They're not in our control, right? They have their own kind of life there. And so these chaotic, because they're very carefully planned, right, these chaotic gestures sort of move towards a different relation with the non-human world, in which we are not the center, right? Something else exists, besides us and beyond us. And I think that this relation to the non-human world also comes across in a different way in some of these pieces, right? In which the presence of such gorgeous nature also brings about a kind of grief, right? And a sense of loss. Because this bounty, right, this harvest is not part of the experience of many people. So the idea of the pastoral here also evokes the flip side, which is a kind of apocalypse, right? As we no longer see this incredible fecundity, I guess, to borrow that word, right, of the world around us. We see that being changed and manipulated and taken away in all kinds of ways. And I think sculptures like Big Beef, for example, right, which you can see upstairs, evoking ideas of big agriculture, the skulls on the wall, that's the kind of loss that this work evokes, right? But by reminding us, like, what happens when you live here? You've done this, pay attention. So as Trevor mentioned, the prairie region is one of the most devastated and altered landscapes in the world. Vegetables for most people are shipped in from other places and wrapped in plastic, and we don't often recognize the nature in our own cities. Like, we don't often think about the cities as urban nature spots, but they are, right? And so that's something that's also really important to acknowledge. And I think, like, Victor's pieces sit at the crossing of refuge and reminder. They're very material illustrations of the impossibility of control and the consequences of trying to impose it. And I'm just going to close by mentioning sort of one other kind of unease, I guess, which is simmering under the surface of some of Victor's works, like Big Beef or Bone Flowers, which function as a sign of a kind of violence that has already been enacted here upon the indigenous peoples of this place, right? So these bones function as a kind of Gothic stand-in, right, for the actual colonial violence that occurred, where it brings it up, but it also kind of distances it at the same time. We have it there, we feel uneasy, we're not quite sure why, something is going on. It's the kind of radioactive fossil, I guess, that Julia was talking about. That's what these pieces do. And I just want to quote Warren Carreau, who happens to be in this room because he's also my husband, who describes a lot of prairie literature as having what he calls a neo-colonial uncanny, a lurking sense that the places settlers call home are not really theirs, and a sense that their current legitimacy as owners or renters in a capitalist land market might well be predicated upon theft, fraud, violence, and other injustices in the past. And I think, like, this lurking sense that Carreau talks about, my husband, Warren, this lurking sense that my husband talks about exists in Victor's Skulls and Bones, for example, through an iconography that recalls not presence but absence. And these skulls, which are profoundly moving, puncture pioneer nostalgia and refuse to let the city rest. Right? These pieces are both speaking and silent. And I want to end there, but I just want to conclude finally by saying that if this actually is, as the National Gallery had it, regional, bucolic, and limited work, I say bring it on. Right? We are here for it. So thank you very much.
Victor, do you want to join us?
Oh.
to rush you, I'm just going to talk here while Nicole's getting everything ready, is we're going to have the two speakers here ask Victor a question, and then we're going to open it up again to the floor. Susan, would you like to ask your question?
Okay. Ready, Victor. My question is, looking back, what do you find most memorable about your public mural experiences?
What do I find memorable? Well, it was a great experience for me, in the sense that the government was building, there were a couple of murals. There was the Sturdy Stone Center, and then there was the Cooperators building. And the commission was open-ended. It was a competition, and the government wanted to install major ceramic work on its Sturdy Stone Center. And I was one of the participants. Fortunately, they, my maquettes, won the praise of the people on the committee, and I got to do a series of work in the lobby, in the main lobby. At first, I thought, well, the main lobby, elevators. Why would I want to, put a work of art up there? What do people do when they stand in a lobby except look up, look down, maybe look at each other, talk with each other. I thought about it, and then I went home, and Fran said, well, how did it go? And I said, well, they want me to do something in the lobby above the elevator door. So she says, what could be better? He says, people look up, you look down, you can do something really interesting that would capture their attention. Which is when I came up with the idea of the old working class. People looking up and the working class looking down. And so that was my first experience. And then a few years later, the government said, well, we've got some space up on the 7th floor or the 8th floor, I think it's the 7th. Would you be interested in doing something else? Well, I said, well, let me think about it. So I drove up to Saskatoon, and I got a coffee and a cinnamon bun, and sat in the lobby and just watched people move back and forth. And they were the same people like me, the first generation, the new working class. It came to my mind. I said, holy moly, that's what I'm going to do. I'll do a whole series on the new working class, and you saw the images on the screen. So for me, that was a profound experience. Then when I got the Cooperators building, phoned me, and it was a competition, and they liked my idea of doing some bird's eye view of the city of Regina, and I won the competition, and the mural is still there. I don't know how long it will be there, because I've got a phone call from them that they're building a new building and they would like to move the mural. And they said, how do you take it down? And I said, well, you won't. You'll have to cut the concrete wall that holds the mural and take it with you if you want to move the mural, because you're not going to take it off the wall. The idea for the piece was my bird's eye view of Regina. It was my home, the first place that I understood the world. Walking its back alleys, riding my bike through the park. That's where I developed my first sense of place. And I think for me that was significant. So both of those murals for me were big projects and projects that had fed me and my work.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Victor.
Hey, Alison, would you like to?
Yeah, I don't really have a question for you, but I was hoping you would talk a little bit about the books you've written in your sculpture. Like, they're such layered pieces. Can you talk a bit about what went into them and what you see in them?
Well, I've always loved books. I mean, I've always been a reader, even as a kid. I remember stopping at the Prince of Wales Library, which was a little house library just about a block and a half away from Wetmore School. And I'd stop and I'd pick up, boys like the Hardy Boys, and really enjoyed reading. And at one point I just decided, I'm not a writer. I'm a storyteller. If I write something, I need somebody else to look at it and say, well, look, maybe you should try this or you should try that. And then I decided, well, you know, I could make a whole series of ceramic books. I could do a whole library of ceramic books, which was a big project which I never undertook. What interested me was, you know, from my California experiences, was you know, playing around with ideas. So I would do a book, how to paint a tomato, for example, or the control of insect pests, where the book is being eaten up by insects. You know, the other, well, there's dozens of titles, I can't think of them all, but you know, the persistence of weeds, the dandelion. You know, I was living on the first house we bought was on Cameron Street. When we were kids living in the Garlic Flats, we said, when we grow up, we're going to buy a house in the rich area of town. And the rich area of town then was Lakeview. But by the time I bought a little house in Lakeview, the rich people had moved elsewhere and built bigger houses. So anyway, we bought the story-and-a-half house, and it was great. It was on the market for $13,000, and I said, look, that's a lot of money. I said, I want a better price. And anyway, I got down to $9,000, and even that was enough. You know, in 1972, or I think, when we bought it. And, you know, we were living in Lakeview, right? The holy moly, you know, this is what we dreamt of when we were kids, living on the East End. And so I fixed up the house, and then, you know, we weren't there long when we decided that, you know, we're going to move out to the country someplace, and that's when we bought the old schoolhouse. You know, planted big gardens, which was my experience growing up in the Garlic Flats. But the books were always generated by something that was going on in my work or in my life. You know, there were, I can't think of the other titles, but there's dozens and dozens of them. So, you know, I said, well, I'm not a writer, but, you know, I can make ceramic books. And what I do, what I like about books is that the feel of the book. You know, like, two books that have always impressed me and I think influenced my life a lot were two books I read when I was a first-year student at university. I had quit school in grade 9 and worked in construction for about 6 years, and finally decided, you know, I always knew I'd go back to school sometime. I didn't know how or when, but we had one brutal winter when, you know, we're working outside, and in order to eat your lunch, you have to put your sandwich on a board and put it in a burn barrel in order to thaw it out so you could eat it. And I thought, you know, this is it. You know, I'm going back to school. So I phoned the registrar at Regina College, and I said, you know, I quit school, I'd like to go back. And he said, well, come and see me. I said, I've got an opening at 4:30. Come and see me at 4:30. I said, well, I've got to go home and change. I've got my carpenter clothes on. He said, I don't care what you've got on. I'll see you at 4:30. So I registered. I got senior matriculation. Then I took first year, because that's all Regina College offered. And Les Crosman was the English teacher. And I remember, you know, when he, you know, read a lot of poetry of Robert Frost, and, you know, I loved his poetry, and I memorized a lot of it. And some of the first books I read were books by James Thurber, My Life and Hard Times. And the title struck me, and I thought, you know, holy moly, that's a bit like my life. I've got to read this guy's book and find out what he's talking about. And he talks about, or he writes about the eccentricities of his family. You know, and I think about the eccentricities of the Garlic Flats and my experience with the people who lived there. So that became a classic book that I've read and reread, and still go back and read. And then the other book was, there were what was it? There's so many of them. The book was A Poor Mouth by Miles, his pen name was Miles Legopoli. And I think his real name was Brian Nolan, I think Brian Nolan. So anyway, I was in the airport in Montreal. And so I go to the book section and I'm looking around and I pick up this book, The Poor Mouth. And I said, holy moly, I gotta check this out, So I read some of the pages. And I said, this is like living in the Garlic Flats. I gotta buy the book. And it became one of my favorite books. It was, really wildly funny and a lot of good, interesting drawings. And so those are the books that kind of inspired me. And so I kept making more ceramic books.
Thank you. Great. So we'll open it up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions for any of us? Timothy and Trevor can also field questions if anyone has any. Okay, we'll start in front here. Yes, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank all of the presenters for the stimulating discussions. Excellent, thank you.
Go ahead and just talk. Yeah.
Okay, so going upstairs, the show is awe-inspiring. Largely the volume of work, Vic. Could you talk about sort of a day in the life in your studio and just how you sort of approach the day and where you housed your clones so that you can sleep?
Can you describe a day in the life of you working in the studio?
Well, a day, I'm an early riser. I usually get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. And then I spend about a half hour doing some Qigong and Tai Chi, and then I have something to eat. And by 8 o'clock, I'm in the studio working. If it's this time of year, I take breaks. I go out the garden and I plant something, or I weed something, or I hoe something, and then back to work. And the garden always inspires me. And at this time of year especially, and I think I've talked about that before, is, if I'm taking a break and having a cup of tea sitting in the garden, I listen to a mockingbird that will sing for half an hour. And these birds are absolutely incredible. They go on and on and on, and I read somewhere where they have 3,000 really interesting variations of sounds that they create. And I think I have now two sets of two nests one in the park behind me, which is the Massey Park, and then one in my yard of mockingbirds. So then I go back to work, and I come in for lunch, and then I go. At this stage in my life, when I'm 84 years young, I usually have about a 20-minute nap, and then I go back to work, and I work till 5 o'clock, and this is a regular work day. It's the only way you get anything done, and for me, it's not. I use the word work, but it's really not work. It's more like play. It's like being a kid again. And I usually have some of my grandkids in my granddaughter who's 7. She's often in the studio. She has her own corner. The 3 boys have all had their own little corners where they come in and work. And it's the energy of those young kids, the grandchildren, that energizes me, because they come up with really interesting ideas. My granddaughter will come up when I'm working on something and I'm painting, and she says, well, what color are you using? And I said, to tell her what I'm trying to do. She says, well, why don't you try this? Or why don't you try that? And she'll just sit there and say, Papa, I want to just sit there and watch you, because I think I want to be an artist too. And that energizes me, and it makes my life in the studio a lot more interesting. That's a day in my life. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for the question. We had another one over here? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious, with the old working class and new working class murals, if you were to make one today of today's working class, what would you want to add into it?
So if you were to make a working class today, like a mural of today, of the working class, who would be in it? Is that a good summary? Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's a good question. It's not something I've never really thought about. What would I do? I would try to create. I think I'd like to do something about, you know, something really profound about climate change, and I really don't know what that, what that really means now. I'd have to really think about it. I think we're living at a time when, the science of climate change is clear. We're not doing much about it. What can we do as artists? What can I do as an artist to make people think about climate change? Maybe we'd have to do with maybe a gardener out in the garden with a spade or a hoe, or planting something, planting a tree, or digging up a lawn and planting a garden, something like that. But it's something I have to really think about, and it's an interesting question. Thank you.
Victor, do you think you might include, just off the top, do you think you might include people in your life from the Philippines, from Mexico, the new working class that have come to Regina?
Would you include it? Okay. Do we have any other questions?
No.
Oh, you didn't hear it? Okay, sorry.
No.
You know what I mean?
No, I heard part of it.
Okay, here. She wants to know if you would include some of the other people who work within your life on a day-to-day basis, like people from Mexico or the Philippines. Would they be part of a new working class?
Why wouldn't they be? For example, I've got this big backyard, a big garden, and it takes a lot of work. I've got a couple of Filipino guys who come in and work for me. They're always looking for work, and I'm looking for people who will do jobs that I don't need to do, so I hire them, and that's an interesting question. Maybe I do something about the new immigrant class coming in. Might be another series. People, we've all been immigrants, more or less. And there are always intolerant people about immigrants coming to this country, and it'd be a good idea maybe to do something about that, or create something.
Yeah.
First of all, I think if you get up at 5 and you don't get to work till 8, you've got time efficiency issues.
It sounds like Neil Devitt. He always has good questions. And we always get into arguments about things. But anyway, I want to hear the question.
Well, he said that, just hang on, Neil, I'll tell him what you said. He said that if you get up at 5 and you don't start work till 8, you've got time efficiency issues.
No, I don't. It takes me about a half hour to do my to do qigong. It takes me maybe another half hour to sit down and have a breakfast of porridge and maybe a soft-boiled egg, and then to do odds and ends around the house or the yard or the garden.
He says he's joking and he's going to get to his question now.
What is the real question?
There's so much discussion about the sturdy stone murals, and you've already pointed out the impossibility of bringing something like that here. But they're monochrome, and they're sort of megalithic. They're large. If it was possible to put these in this show, would that have changed a little bit the perception of your work in general? Would the National Gallery, for instance, be more inclined to look at something of that monumental status, size, something that harkens back to medieval buildings and churches? It has the scale, I guess, and it has the lack of gorgeous color gives it a severity, a seriousness. I'm just wondering, I'm just musing now, because now you're talking about what would you do if you did another one of these things? How would you do it? And would that scale maybe give you another opportunity to work and show your work in a different way?
So if you were to do another mural, how would you do it? And the scale is the other question. Would you make it as big, and would you leave it as like raw clay like the terracotta pieces, or would you get some glaze involved? Is that summarizing?
Like Oldenburg, or, but if you make things really big sometimes, you get attention. Like the Easter Island statues were not so interesting, but the fact that they were so big and it was such a big deal for the British to put that on a sailing ship and bring it home. There is something about the monumentality of size, and also the lack of primary colors and things almost makes something seem more serious. And it is viewed differently. Sculpture's viewed differently sometimes when it's not colored.
I just personally, I think scale is a modernist thing, and what I always say is sometimes bigger is just bigger. It's not always better. But the modernist mindset is that bigger is better.
Your personal opinion is clear because you love the show and we all do. But my question is, there are people out there who are fascinated by other things, including Diana Neumanoff and her time and other people. It's within this room, just throwing out that question because those works do stand apart from the rest of Vic's work. And there was one period of his life, and yet those are still discussed as important pieces. And they received almost as much discussion as all the other pieces that he had in the show.
Do you want to answer anything about those? Can I put you on the spot, Susan? I also think that scale is very important in Victor's work. And we've talked a lot about the murals, but there's also, and I mentioned in my talk, the idea of miniaturization. So the outhouses are miniaturized. And what happens with miniaturization is that you have a switch in perception, and Susan Surette talks a lot about this. The idea, and there's been studies that have been done, when people look into miniatures, time slows down, their perception of time slows down. And Victor does a really good job.
I'm not criticizing what he does, he's worked it out, he's done it beautifully.
Yeah.
Just another element of it, and just because of the way things, the direction of attention in this discussion and in the talks, it made me think that there's a major part of his work that happened in a short period of his career at one moment, and it's received a lot of attention. And if it could have been transported here, it would have been very interesting to see it as part of this show.
Yeah, for sure. But we have the maquettes. We've done our best. We also have an amazing film that does an amazing job. Thank you, the filmmakers are here, by the way.
It's not a criticism
Yeah.
of the show. The show is wonderful. I'm just saying that because he was discussing what he might do in the future, if he was given the opportunity or he had the will to do something else, I just thought it was an interesting concept because Victor spent half of his life fighting with the National Gallery and I think he's honed his writing skills, talking to debating things with people on these call occasions.
Yeah, so I will finish my thought on scale, and then we'll leave it at that. So the miniaturization, you have what happens with a miniature is people approach it, they look into it, and the viewer becomes the giant in that sense, and time slows down. So we have a lot of pieces in the show that are like that, where you have the opened rooms where you can look inside at things. We also have the opposite, for instance, with Big Beef. And Timothy and I'll sort of give a little hint here. We actually hung that slightly higher than, we had a big debate about that piece. And that was in part to get that sense of scale, to get the sense of the monumental. We want people to walk up to that and you look up. So all of a sudden now, the artist and the work is the giant and you become the miniature. To make you start to think.
It's a wonderful show.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. So that's what we're doing in terms of looking at scale and playing with scale and trying to explore it in Victor's work, which he noted even in 1970 was really important. You said in an interview once that you were interested in playing with big and small. So.
I am, and just to go back a little bit, if I were to do another monumental thing. What I would do is probably do a monumental hand and something to go with it. Like the hand with a big potato that you have in your collection. Where it's not God creating Adam, but it's the creative hand producing the potato, or it could be whatever my helpers, my garden helpers, do for me in my garden, you know. It'd be interesting to make a huge piece of sculpture for that. Something huge, that could be, have images of it being, suspended somewhere or on something, and the fruit, or maybe the potato, or maybe a cabbage, or maybe just a big head of garlic.
I'd like to say something about the monumental and the Diana Nemiroff whole idea I think that you're talking about, is that I don't think the monumental is what stopped his work from getting into the gallery. I think it was really a prejudice about craft, as Julie pointed out, because they have all sorts of bowls of, oh my God, I'm having a senior moment.
We all have them.
Emily Carr's work that are very small and not very well done and very low fired and very derivative from First Nations designs on them. And those are in the National Gallery because I was invited to look at them at one point. So I don't think it's scale that's got to do with it. I think it's really a prejudice against regionality and against contemporary craft materials, and perhaps about the relationship. Well, I think that's really it in a nutshell, and I don't think it's anything to do with monumentality.
Okay, maybe one more? Yes? Okay, yeah, go ahead, David.
So, just a couple comments vis-a-vis scale. If large scale is a water thing, I don't know what the Egyptians were up to. That said, a bit of information. The Gradient sculpture, for those of you who are interested, went to the North Battleford Museum, to the Western History Development, Western Development Museum in North Battleford, and has been there since 1976. It was on view several years, then moved into storage, subsequently has been in deep storage for 30 years, which means it's been stuffed back with parts of it. Now, the good news is, there's an exhibition in Moose Jaw that I would suggest all of you go and see, but that has resulted in a renewed interest on the part of the curators in the gradient. They have gone to see it and said that the good news about the fact that it was deep storage under parts is it's pretty much like the day it was made. And it is, the most recent information is it's on the way to Moose Jaw, to the Western Development Museum in Moose Jaw. I think that Jennifer, the curator there, has been telling me that it seems like it's about to come to Moose Jaw and be displayed again after 40 years, I suppose. So it'll be there at least for several months, and we're hoping, with inertia being the way it is, with government organizations and departments and so forth, that once it's there for a few months, it might end up being there for a few years, and maybe if all of you go there and you write exciting, wonderful things about it, it will encourage you to keep it there. So there is some good news in terms of at least another one of the public pieces that Victor was involved with. It will come back into the public view, and it'll be, well, from my perspective, and I'm sure Vic's perspective, and so it's going to be great to see it again after all.
Okay, well, I think that concludes our afternoon today. Thank you so much for everyone for sticking with it. I know it was a long afternoon, but hopefully you've got thinking about Victor's work in new and productive ways. We invite you all to go back up and take another look at the exhibition. And lastly, I'd just like to thank our panelists. It's been really great to have you.